Yes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this talk, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Irina Filatova and to say welcome to her. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to a very long and brilliant CV. So, Irina Filatova is a professor of the State University, High School of Economics in Moscow, and Professor Emeritus and Senior Research Fellow of the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Now, from 1973 to 1992, she was a lecturer, then professor and head of Department of African Studies at Moscow State University. Then in 1992 to 2002, Irina was professor and head of Department of History at the University of Durban-Westville, and I say that very proudly because that's my alma mater. It's now the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And then from 2002 to the present, Professor Emeritus and Senior Research Associate at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the National Research University, the highest school of economics in Moscow. Now, I remember some years ago, many, many years ago, reading Cancer Ward and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I always marveled and told friends that it's writers like Solzhenitsyn who might have contributed to bringing justice and opening up the Soviet Union. But when I got to university, I was hijacked by a Marxist group who told me that behind the Iron Curtain lies an utopia. They didn't want to speak to me after 1990 when I asked them where was that utopia. So on that brief note, welcome to Irene, and I hope you enjoyed very much. Thank you.
Now, how do I check that? Oh. Right, can you do, sorry Matthew, can you do the side slides or not?
Unfortunately, the project is below.
Okay. Well, I hope that I will manage all this technology. First of all, thank you very much, all of you, for coming here to listen to me. I think the topic is important, but, you know, it is not really something that is happening today. Unfortunately, I think that what happened with the Russian Revolution is still relevant to what is going here in South Africa and partially to what is going on everywhere in the world. What we see here is the tricentenary of the Romanov dynasty, which, right, I don't understand what is going on here. Right. Of the Romanov dynasty, which they celebrated in 1913. The dynasty seemed absolutely impregnable. To understand why the revolution happened, we have to have a look what was Russia in the 19th century, particularly in the late 19th century. It was an autocracy. There were no representative institutions. There were no elected institutions. It was an absolute monarchy, and it seemed that it is very firm and very, very strong. Yet, this is the other side of this celebration. This is the Tsar's family, the emperor's family, going through the back door of their palace to start the celebration. And you can see, for me, this picture is the image of the crumbling Russian Empire. Look, this is the Tsarist exit. And look at the walls. Look at the plaster which has gone off. And that is really what the back door of the Russian Empire was. 80% of the population of the Russian Empire consisted of peasants. They were not really peasants, they were serfs, which is virtually slaves. They were owned by the landed gentry. They did not have the land of their own, and they were mostly poor. In the 1860s, the Tsar Alexander II introduced reforms. The main of these reforms was the liberation of slaves. The Russian aristocracy opposed this move as long as it could, but the Tsar decided that it has to be done, and it was done. Unfortunately, the peasants were liberated without the land. They got their freedom, but they had to pay the state for their freedom. They had to pay redemption payments so that the state could pay their former owners. Moreover, the land that the peasants were finally getting when they've paid their redemption payments, they were not getting as individual families or individual owners. It was given to the village communes. And village communes redistributed and redistributed this land again and again and again, which meant that on the one hand, there were no particularly poor peasants, but there were also no rich peasants, which means that the Russian peasants were not used to any stratification, social stratification in their midst. That process, land reform, was accompanied by very fast industrialization. The industrialization in the second half of the last 40 years of the 19th century was really very, very fast. And all those peasants who wanted to earn money for their redemption payments, they rushed to the cities, new factories were created. These poor workers were paid next to nothing. They worked more than 14 hours a day. They had no accommodation. Sometimes they had a bunk as an accommodation for 2 or 3 people. Sometimes they had just a corner. And, of course, they were paid peanuts. Now, it was also in the last 40 years of the 19th century when revolution started to spread in Russia. What I mean by that is several things. Popularity of socialist ideas, popularity of anti-monarchist ideas, and popularity of terrorism. Terrorism was a very widely spread phenomenon in Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century. In 1881, the Tsar Liberator Alexander II was assassinated by a terrorist bomb. And this is Lenin's brother, Alexander Ulyanov, who was also a terrorist and who was executed in 1887. This is the picture of Russia as it was. It was quite ripe for change, and the change was not coming. So it came quite unexpectedly on the 9th January of 1905. What happened was that a huge demonstration led by the clergy went to the Tsar to hand in a petition containing their demands, not even demands, informing the Tsar about their problems and asking him to help because they thought that the Tsar just doesn't know how bad off they are. Instead of the Tsar, they were met by the mounted guards who started shooting at the crowd. And this is the scene after that demonstration. The Tsar was hunting at that time, and he didn't say a word. He didn't come out to the masses. He didn't do anything. So that very day, barricades started to go up in St. Petersburg, and the revolution began. The revolution was exacerbated by the Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. That was 1904-1905. It was really a humiliation for the Russian army. It was a huge army, but it was poorly fed, poorly equipped, poorly armed, and it was sent to the Far East to fight against Japan. Now, this is how the Russian government presented what would happen in the Russo-Japanese War, and this is what happened in reality. This is the Russian troop being taken prisoner in Port Arthur. So the revolution consisted of very many demonstrations, strikes. Tens of thousands of people were on the streets. And this picture actually reflects the way the way St. Petersburg looked at that time, because it was, at the beginning, the revolution of the middle classes. Look at them. They are not workers. They are not peasants. They are definitely middle-class people, and that's how it was. And they are celebrating the date on top of there is 1905, 17 October. That is because on that day, the Tsar signed a manifesto which granted freedoms to the population. The freedoms were civil rights and the parliament, the Duma, elected parliament. Unfortunately, the revolution had another face, which is the peasants, those poor peasants who started looting and burning the estates, and they, of course, got whatever they could out of these estates. And, of course, it had a different face. In December 1905, Moscow was a stage of an uprising, armed uprising. And, of course, the uprising was absolutely drowned in blood. That was the end of the revolution. The Duma was convened, but gradually it became clear that the government is going back on its promises. First of all, repression started. This was called Stolypin's neckties. That is obviously people hanged. Between 1906 and 1911, 3,000 people were killed. Executed. But there was another aspect, another outcome of this this revolution. The outcome was that the government decided to continue with the land reform, to have another set of the land reform, which is cancel the payments and give the land to private owners as a property, finally. It was the first time that the Russian peasants owned their own land. Of course, it led naturally to the social stratification. Some got the land, some sold it immediately, some coped, some not. But there did appear a class of strong owners, strong farmers who were richer than others. This is a family of one of such farmers. Now, the reform started to work and everything started to sort of normalize, but it was at that moment when the First World War started. Now, this is again the government poster of the First World War. This is what was supposed to happen. I mean, you see the German there, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Turk. All of them are trying to get to Russia, and this is a Russian Cossack who helps them to do that, as they say, but of course they are all dead. Now, this is what happened in reality. Russia was defeated in the First World War. It suffered enormous suffering and enormous defeats. Russia lost about 2 million people in the First World War. This is more than any other European power. Turkey lost more, but anyway, in Europe that was the highest number. And the morale of the army was absolutely low. It started to desert. It started to collapse. Now, one thing that happened and that triggered the revolution at that time was this is the beginning of the February 1917 revolution. What triggered it was that because of the war, all communications were broken. The state was not coping with supplies, it had to supply the army, let alone the population was completely left out. So for several days and weeks, the bread was not delivered to Petrograd. It was how St. Petersburg was renamed during the war. So Petrograd was sitting without bread. And the revolution was started by women who were queuing for bread for days on end, not getting the bread, and they started rioting. So from these bread riots, they were supported by the workers, and you can see huge demonstrations here. Huge demonstrations. All right. What was the difference between this revolution and 1905? There was a very big difference. First of all, the numbers. In February 1917, the numbers were much, much, much bigger. The peasant looting was much more widely spread. Now, the uprisings went throughout the country. It started more or less peacefully, but the workers who participated, mostly the workers of Petrograd, they were armed because the deserters gave them their arms. Now, the deserters participated, but more than anything, one more difference, the elite was split. Part of the elite supported the revolution, part of it didn't. But more than anything, what was most important was actually we know in connection with this revolution the names of Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, whatever. But this guy, non-commissioned officer Kirpichnikov, did more for the revolution, for the success of the revolution than any other person, because he was the first in the Petrograd garrison who led his regiment to assist the uprising, to assist the revolution. This was 600 people, and they were the first, and he showed the example. Now, on the part of the government, to keep that garrison in the center of the city, and it consisted mostly of young soldiers who were trained to be sent to the front, was an incredible stupidity, because there were 160,000 of them. And one after another, this regiment started supporting the revolution. That was the death knell for the regime. Soon they were joined by the Marines of the Kronstadt naval base close by. You see, the revolution started on 23rd February, and already on the 2nd March, Nicholas II abdicated because there was absolutely nothing to do, and his surrounding persuaded him that he had to abdicate. He abdicated in favor of his brother, and his brother abdicated immediately after that. Now, until now, I have not mentioned any Bolsheviks. And I'm sorry, this is the only chart I'm going to subject you to. But it is absolutely necessary if we want to understand why the Bolsheviks came to power. It is very important to understand what happened in the course of that revolution. The revolution, February Revolution, created the situation of dual power. What does that mean? That means that the Duma, which was the legal body at the head after the abdication, it was the only legal body that could form the government. It did form the government, which was called provisional government. Provisional because it was decided that the country needs Constituent Assembly, the Constituent Assembly, which would work out the constitution, the government, the way elections would work, and so on. So basically that had to be the assembly of all the existing parties. But provisional government was not popular because it consisted of the Tsarist ministers and some very conservative people. So what was popular was the Petrograd Soviet. Generally speaking, Soviets started to spring up throughout the country. What is a Soviet? A Soviet is just a council. This form of self-organization emerged in 1905 during that revolution. Then they were just councils which decided where the demonstration has to go, what to do, what slogans to put up. So it was not particularly directed by any particular force or person. But, of course, revolutionaries, social democrats were very prominent in that. Now, in the February 1917 revolution, what happened was that the Soviets sprang up again, and the Petrograd Soviet in particular, Soviet Council of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies it was called. During that February Revolution, what happened was that it was definitely managed, directed by three parties: Mensheviks, Socialist Revolutionaries, and Bolsheviks. Now, I have not mentioned Bolsheviks until now because they were really not very prominent. Let me just see what is the next thing. No, we go back here. So why is that? Now, Lenin's party, which was the party which was called Socialist, just a moment, a Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party. It emerged for the first time in 1898 with the first Congress in Minsk. All of its leadership was arrested very, very shortly, after a short period of time, and it was Lenin's first arrest and Lenin's first exile. Now, after that, what happened was that many of its leaders, the social democrats, went into exile, including Lenin. He briefly returned during the 1905-1906, he was in Russia in 1905-1906, and then he had to go to the exile again because the repression started again. So the second Congress of this Russian Social Democratic Labour Party took place in London in 1903. And already at that Congress, what happened was that Social Democrats divided into two factions. One was Mensheviks, one was Bolsheviks. I will not go into the names, it's just one was majority, one was minority, but what was important was that Mensheviks thought that Russian population is not ready for the socialist revolution. And that is why the coming revolution will be a bourgeois revolution, and that socialist revolutionaries, socialists, have to support it. They, generally speaking, thought that propaganda, education about socialist matters, that is what is important. Bolsheviks were a completely opposite view. They thought that whether the Russians are ready for the socialist revolution or not, we have to push for it. Whatever the nature of the revolution, and they also thought that the coming revolution was bourgeois. They thought that they have actively and arms in hand to push for the socialist revolution. So that division somehow was concealed during the 1905 revolution, and generally speaking, there were other parties which participated, so they were not very prominent. During the February 1917 revolution, they were very prominent, they were completely different, and they were different in several respects. Some respects I told you, but they were by now separate parties. And what was more important from the point of view of Bolsheviks coming to power, they were still a very small party. And yet they won the revolution. They came to power. The reason was that the Mensheviks, in their ideology, in corresponding with their ideology, they thought that they have to support the provisional government, and so did the socialist revolutionaries, which was the peasant party. So these two parties supported the provisional government. Without their support, provisional government was nothing. Not only they supported it, but they also gradually started to send their representatives to be part of the provisional government. The Bolshevik influence gradually grew. Now, Lenin came back from exile in April 1917. He came back in a sealed train. He was in exile in Germany, and in a sealed train, the Germans allowed the sealed train through their territory because they were hoping that Lenin and the revolutionaries who were on the train with him will help the revolution, will help to collapse the Russian front, which they certainly duly did. Now, Lenin having come immediately, despite what his party thought, he immediately started propagating the uprising. Despite all the advice of his colleagues, despite their vote, he said and he insisted, and he had a very great power of persuasion. So he insisted that the Bolsheviks should go for an uprising and should do it alone, without any other parties. His colleagues at first thought that he was mad, but he wasn't. He just knew exactly what he was doing. He persuaded them. And in July 1917, such uprising began. In July 1917, what happened was that armed workers, armed soldiers and armed Marines from Kronstadt and the general population all went into the streets. It was a huge demonstration. At first it was peaceful, but they were all armed, and it was hundreds of thousands of people. And they demanded all power to the Soviets, all power to the Soviets. So down with the provisional government. But I will return here. You see, all power to the Soviets, but the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries did not want to take that power. There was one moment during that demonstration when the Mensheviks' headquarters were in the Soviet, in the Petrograd Soviet, was surrounded by the armed Marines, and one of them put the fist to the face of one of the leaders of the Mensheviks and shouted, "You goat, are you going to take power or not?" So that was the situation. The problem with that uprising for the Bolsheviks was that they didn't manage the crowd. The crowd was so huge, and their popularity, their organization was still not very big or very well. They were not very well organized. So they did not manage to manage the crowd. And shooting and looting and absolutely erratic arrests started. Basically the government managed to suppress this uprising. Because the demonstration went under the Bolshevik slogans and under the Bolshevik banners, it was obvious that the Bolsheviks organized it and that the Bolsheviks were behind it. So immediately their leadership was either arrested or it had to go into hiding. And what was also very important, that at this point, provisional government reminded the population that Lenin arrived in this sealed train during the war through the German territory. That meant that he, of course, was a spy, and it was very easy to accuse the Bolshevik government of being spies in favor of Germany. Particularly, this was particularly, hateful at that time, at that moment. This German connection was was particularly hated because the Empress was a German, and he was one of the worst hated persons in Russia at that time. Now, here is Lenin in disguise and hiding in Finland. At this difficult hour, he still insisted that the uprising should come. The uprising was inevitable, and it has to come, and it has to come soon. Now, the Bolsheviks, who were at the bottom of their popularity, and they were not anywhere to be seen. Some of them were in prison, some of them were in hiding, and at that moment, an event happened that helped them back and helped them at the very top of events. General Kornilov, one of the popular generals of the First World War, decided to save motherland, to save the motherland. What that meant for him was that he would bring the loyal troops with him to Petrograd. The Petrograd, it was possible for him to actually capture power. It was possible for him to announce himself a dictator, but his goal was actually to restore order and to help the provisional government to restore order. The provisional government was scared. They did not want to accept his assistance because they thought that these troops which are moving to Petrograd are going to arrest them and are going to declare Kornilov as a dictator, and then the repressions would start. So they didn't trust Kornilov, and as a result, what they had to do is to ask the Soviets for help. Now, I have to go back to that thing again, to that chart again, because what was happening in the Soviets was that gradually Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries were losing their popularity, and the Bolsheviks were gaining popularity. Of course, July uprising got it down, but the thing is that all the time, while Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries and the provisional government were thinking about the details of the constitution, were arguing about the principles of the new elections, where they were discussing the theory, which revolution it is and who should be in government and so on and so forth, the Bolsheviks did one thing that was the most important for the revolution, of course. They were going to the troops, and they spread the Bolsheviks' propaganda among the troops. So by the time the provisional government decided to fight Kornilov and decided to ask the Soviets for help, what happened was that only the Bolsheviks could help, because only they could bring out the troops. Only they controlled the Petrograd garrison, and only they controlled the Marines of the Kronstadt naval base. So that was something that they have got right, and the government got wrong, and the other parties got wrong. So after the Bolshevik assistance, the provisional government had absolutely nobody to defend them, because other troops were somewhere far away in the, on the front, Now, Kornilov was not defeated in battle, actually. What happened was that he refused to shoot into the soldiers of his own army. Okay, they are revolutionary soldiers, but he just didn't want to shoot at them. And he allowed himself to be arrested, himself and his top generals who helped him. They were all arrested. They were led during the Bolshevik coup. They were led by the provisional government, by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, but the provisional government itself remained defenseless. This is the women's battalion, which was the last thing that the provisional government had to defend it, plus several junkers. Now, that was not a serious force, and what happened, of course, was that several people were killed, several ladies were raped, and of course, provisional government was arrested without any difficulty whatsoever. Just at that time, provisional government was arrested, and just at that time, the Second Congress of the Soviets took place. Lenin came to this Congress and announced that the provisional government is arrested and that the Soviets are now in power. Now, there were still Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries in the Soviets. They protested. I mean, for them, this was a coup. It was not a revolution. And it was a coup because Bolsheviks had no mandate either from the government or from the Soviets to arrest the provisional government. So they left. They left this Congress and basically left the floor to the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks, in the name of the Soviets, in the name of this Congress, where they were alone now, created a new government, which was a completely, totally Bolshevik government without participation of any other parties. Bolsheviks' last attempt at legitimizing that power was the Constituent Assembly, which they duly convened a few days later. When they convened it, they discovered that they were in the minority in the Constituent Assembly, that socialist revolutionaries had the majority, and together with other parties, with the Mensheviks and bourgeois parties, Bolsheviks had no way to get the approval of their government, first, and second, they had no way to pass any of their resolutions. They offered several resolutions, none of them passed, and they left. Just as the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries left the Soviet, the Bolsheviks left the Constituent Assembly. The other parties went on debating. They went on debating for 13 hours, late into the morning, I think 5 o'clock in the morning, when the guards, who were red guards and who were all Bolshevized, who were all Bolsheviks, they came to the chairman and said, look, the guards are tired, the meeting is over. The meeting had to be dissolved, and the next day, when the deputies of the Constituent Assembly came to the venue of the meeting, they discovered that the venue is closed. There was an attempted demonstration in support of the Constituent Assembly, but the very same Red Guards just dissolved the demonstration, shooting several people. Lenin did not know about this altercation at night, and when he was told what happened, he couldn't stop laughing. He laughed and laughed and laughed, and that was the end of any opposition to the Bolshevik power, at least at that moment. Now, It is now clear why and how Bolsheviks got to power, but that was the easy part. How did they manage to keep power? How did they manage to stay in power, despite the fact that the economy was ruined? The Bolsheviks' first decrees virtually ruined the economy. They ruined the country. The first decree was the decree of peace. Very nice, and it called on all parties, all countries to stop fighting. But of course, that collapsed the Russian front, but the Germans immediately started the advance and got a huge chunk of the Russian territory. Then the decree on land, which announced that all the land is now nationalized and belongs to the people. The peasants did not understand that by the act of nationalizing the land, they have lost their private property on land. At that time, they didn't really pay any attention to that. What they paid attention to was that the remaining land, which was still not in their property, could be grabbed, and that's exactly what they did. Now, banks were nationalized already during the coup, and enterprises, factories, and so on were nationalized a few days after the revolution. And so all the connections, all the ties, the trade stopped, the communication stopped. The peasants did not produce because of the war and because the civil war started and because there was nothing to buy in the cities. The shops were closed. The cities did not get any food, so the Bolsheviks had to introduce food dictatorship, which meant that the food, any grain, was taken by force from the peasants. So by 1920, Russia produced about 20% of what it produced before the First World War. The economy collapsed. Now, the Civil War, how did they manage in these circumstances to keep the power? There were several things why they managed to do this, several reasons why they managed to do this. Reason number one, the peasants. You see, the peasants thought that they got the land from the Bolsheviks. And however much they detested the war, the civil war, and so on, they participated. They participated on both sides, the white guards and the red guards. But gradually what they got was that the white guards, on coming to power in any particular territory, tried to restore the gentry land ownership. This was a huge mistake. Both parties, the Reds and the Whites, committed unimaginable atrocities, and the war was dehumanizing the population. But it was both sides, and only one side returned the land to the people. The workers, why did they do nothing about it? Well, they did actually. There were uprisings, the Kronstadt uprising in 1921. The very same Marines who supported the revolution now stopped supporting the revolution. But the workers believed in the bright future now that all the assets belong to the people. They belong to us, the factories and so on. This was a wonderful dream of equality, prosperity, and so on. So they did believe. They believed in this Bolshevik propaganda. They went on supporting and supporting and supporting and losing lives in the Civil War. There was also another element to it, to the Bolshevik managing to keep power. I think that, oops, what is going on now? Okay. You see, this is a dreadful, dreadful picture. What it is that, of course, the Civil War and the revolution, and the collapse of agriculture and the collapse of industry led to the famine. The famine in 1921-23 killed about 5 million people. This was mostly in the area of the lower Volga and Ukraine. This is just one of these awful pictures when the bodies of people who died in just a few days in just one town on the Volga River, Buzuluk, were collected and taken to the cemetery in that town. Now, the civil war, we would never know how many people died, but the estimates are between 3 million and 8 million. 2 million people emigrated, and the Bolsheviks still stayed in power. Now, one thing, I gave you several reasons. Now, one reason which was very, very important was the propaganda abroad. One hope that the Bolsheviks had when they came to power was that there will be a world revolution which will support them, that the revolution in Russia will trigger the world revolution, and it didn't. On the contrary, it brought the intervention. So in 1919, on Lenin's initiative, they created the Communist International. The Communist International was an international organization centered in Moscow, which united the majority of communist parties of the world. These communist parties sprang up, unlike socialist parties which existed in the 19th century. The communist parties sprang up in the early 20th century, but particularly after the Russian Revolution, particularly 1920, 1921, one country after another, including South Africa, all these parties emerged. And all of them wanted to act together, and all of them wanted guidance from Moscow. So Moscow gave that guidance. Communist International was a huge organization. It had its own universities, several of them, where it educated the leadership of foreign countries. It had several branches, sort of umbrella organizations abroad, which were used for the Bolshevik propaganda. There were emissaries sent by the Bolsheviks to lead the other communist parties, to show them the way, to give them the money, and so on and so forth. Basically, it was an attempt at exporting the revolution. Comintern had a purpose of exporting the revolution, and then it had a purpose of defending Russia as the seat of the first socialist government. Only in 1935, the last Congress of the Communist International, 7th Congress, had some sort of a more plausible agenda, which is a united front against the Nazis, but that was still to come. Now, Communist International created, first of all, the propaganda was effective. And the foreign armies, the intervention had to end because the foreign armies started to be subjected to that propaganda, and the foreign governments were afraid that they will have their revolutions too, and they did partially. So Bolshevik propaganda was one of the most important reasons why the intervention did not continue. Communist International created a whole army of fighters for the Bolshevik ideas. During Stalin's purges in 1937-38, when about 1,500 people were assassinated daily, were executed daily, Comintern suffered more than any other organization in terms of proportions. What it means is that 50% of its staff was executed, and the rest of them went to the camps to die, to the Stalin's labor camps to die there. Leaders of the communist parties, other communist parties, were also suffered, not only the leaders, actually the members who were students at communist universities also suffered. Many of them were executed. But they were the believers. Those who survived took the message of the Bolsheviks into the 1960s and 1970s. They were the believers. You see, for them, the Soviet Union, the ideals of the Soviet Union were so important that they were ready to give their lives for it. They lived in one hotel in the center of Moscow, which was called Central Hotel. Every night during the 1937 and 38, at 3 o'clock at night, a KGB car would drive to the entrance of the hotel, and nobody was sleeping, of course, and they were listening to where the KGB, which door the KGB was coming to. Some of the victims managed to shoot themselves before the KGB opened the door. Some of them killed themselves by jumping into the windows. But for me, the most awful thing is that they never jumped into the street. They always jumped into the internal courtyard. And they did it because the Soviet population who would see them on the street would think that something was wrong, that something was wrong with the Communist International or with the Bolsheviks or with the government or something. They were not allowed to know that. So these disciplined cadres remained faithful to the Soviet ideals to the end. Now, the last thing that I want to say is that the long shadow, basically. Stalin dominated the Soviet history during the whole of the 20th century. He created the system which existed until the end of the USSR, and the remnants of it are being revived even now. Now, Stalin, we may argue, and historians argued endlessly, whether Stalin was the continuation of the Lenin's policy, or he started a completely new counter-revolutionary era. This is a very theoretical question, but what is absolutely practical and what is completely obvious is that the Stalin was a child of the October Revolution. His whole mentality was formed by the revolution. In what sense? First of all, he perceived, his whole vision of the world was that Russia is a laager. It is surrounded by enemies who are prepared to attack it at any moment. He knew that he can rely only on force. He cannot rely on the trust of the population or love of the population. He can rely on force and brute force alone. His repressions themselves, this great purge of 37, 38, his close confidant, closest friend and confidant, and his foreign minister Molotov, he lived a long life, and later on he remembered, he said that, 1937 was absolutely necessary. It was because of 1937 that we didn't have the fifth column. They remembered, Bolsheviks remembered, and Stalin remembered how the Bolsheviks came to power. It was war. It was betrayal of the army. The army betrayed its government. And it was the split at the top. This is exactly what Stalin wanted to avoid before the Second World War. He understood the power of the propaganda, and that was also something that he remembered all his life. Soviet propaganda became one of the most potent propagandas in the world. So all of these traits existed in the USSR, and they partially exist until today. I'm finishing here. So please, if you have any questions, do ask. Thank you. Yes? Can you come closer? I don't hear you.
First of all, thank you for your talk. I just would like to know, in the beginning you showed a slide of Father Gaffer leading the first revolution, the first protest, first major protest.
That is the 9th January 1905, yeah.
Was he actually a socialist or a communist?
He was neither a socialist nor a communist. There is a debate whether he worked for Akhrana, which is the security service of the Tsarist government. That is I'm not going to find it now, that first demonstration led by clergy, where you can see somebody standing in front of the demonstration and going towards the mounted guards. You see, he was very popular among the workers. He said he was propagating not socialist ideas exactly, but he was telling the people that the Tsar doesn't know, we have to write a petition. He could get together all these masses who went with him, but whether it was a provocation or not, it is very difficult to judge. The Soviet propaganda did assert that it was a provocation, but it's not known. Yes?
What was the role of the Russian Orthodox Church during this time?
Well, the Russian Orthodox Church during this time, which time? The late 19th century, and generally speaking, 19th century, the Russian Orthodox Church was a very bureaucratic organization which was controlled by the government. The Synod, the Ministry of Religions, if you want, was one of the branches of the government. On the one hand, the Russians were very religious. On the other hand, the concrete priests were sometimes hated because they knew very much, they knew very little, they were very lazy. They lived off their parishes, which just supplied them with something. They were not very literate, and so on. So monarchy was supported by the Russian Orthodox Church to the end. But, of course, during the revolution, the mood completely changed, and the Russians stopped believing in the sanctity of the church. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.